In a quiet village nestled in the heart of Prussia, where church spires pierced low-hanging winter clouds and hymns drifted through snow-laced air, a boy was born into a lineage of faith. Friedrich Nietzsche came into the world in 1844, the son of a Lutheran pastor, a man whose sermons echoed not just from the pulpit, but through generations of pious ancestors. God was not an idea in this house. He was the architecture of daily life, the rhythm of prayer, the compass of morality. But the divine order Nietzsche was born into would not hold. When he was only 5 years old, his father fell ill, first in body, then in mind. The man who once spoke with certainty of heaven's grace began to lose his words, then his memory, then himself. Young Friedrich watched as faith failed to save the one who embodied it. His father died soon after, leaving behind silence where sermons used to live. That silence became fertile ground. Raised by his mother, his grandmother, and 2 aunts, all devout, all grieving, Friedrich buried himself in books. Latin, Greek, scripture, music. He was brilliant, yes, but also haunted. By death, by absence, by the terrifying possibility that the world might not be governed by divine justice, but by something far more indifferent. By 14, he was composing essays on the chosen people and writing music with the solemnity of a cathedral organist. At 19, he entered the University of Bonn, then transferred to Leipzig, immersing himself in classical philology with almost monastic devotion. He could read Homer as if the poet were whispering directly into his ear. He dissected ancient texts like a surgeon probing the soul of Western civilization. And then, at the astonishing age of 24, before most men finished their doctorates, he was appointed professor of classical philology at the University of Basel. The youngest in the institution's history, Europe took notice. Here was a thinker with the precision of a scholar and the soul of a poet. Yet even as he lectured on Greek tragedy and ancient meter, a storm brewed within him. He devoured the dark philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, who declared life a cycle of suffering. He formed an intense, almost mystical friendship with Richard Wagner, the composer who dreamed of art as modern religion. Together they imagined a rebirth of myth, of beauty, of spiritual grandeur in a disenchanted age. In 1872, Nietzsche published The Birth of Tragedy, a work so audacious it scandalized his academic peers. He argued that Greek greatness emerged not from reason, but from the tension between 2 artistic forces, the rational, ordered Apollonian, and the ecstatic, chaotic Dionysian. Civilization, he suggested, needed both, and modern Europe, with its blind faith and progress in science, had forgotten the wild, sacred intoxication of existence. The scholarly world recoiled, his career stalled. But Nietzsche didn't care. He was no longer writing for professors. He was writing for the future. And yet even as his mind soared, his body betrayed him. Migraines like iron bands around his skull, blurred vision that turned pages into ghosts, sleepless nights filled with feverish thought. He began to wander through the Alps, along the Italian coast, seeking air, light, and silence. He would soon break with Wagner, disillusioned by the composer's nationalism and piety. He would begin to question not just Christianity, but morality itself. But that rupture lay ahead. For now, in this fragile moment between youth and destiny, Friedrich Nietzsche stood at the edge of a new world, one he would spend the rest of his life trying to name and to warn us about. Because if God was truly dead, who would take his place? By the late 1870s, Friedrich Nietzsche was a man unmoored. He had resigned from his professorship in Basel, his health collapsing under the weight of chronic pain, failing eyesight, and sleepless nights that stretched into weeks. The academic world, once his proving ground, now treated him as a cautionary tale, a brilliant mind derailed by eccentricity. But Nietzsche wasn't broken. He was being forged. Wandering alone through the mountain villages of Switzerland and the sun-bleached coasts of Italy, he carried little more than a notebook, a walking stick, and an ever-deepening contempt for the idols of his age. Christianity, democracy, nationalism, even the Enlightenment's cherished faith in reason, all of it, he believed, was a mask for weakness masquerading as virtue. His break with Richard Wagner marked a turning point. Once he had seen the composer as a kindred spirit, a modern Aeschylus weaving myth into music. But when Wagner embraced German nationalism and cloaked his art in Christian sentimentality, Nietzsche felt not just disappointment, but betrayal. "I have lost a friend," he wrote, "but I have found my destiny." And what a destiny it was. In the thin air of Sils Maria, high in the Engadin Valley, Nietzsche began to hear a voice, not his own, but something older, wilder, more prophetic. It spoke in parables, in riddles, in laughter that bordered on madness. From this voice came, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a book unlike any other in philosophy. Part scripture, part satire, part symphony of thought. Here, Nietzsche introduced the world to the Übermensch, the overman, not a superhuman tyrant, as later distortions would claim, but a figure who creates meaning in a world stripped of divine guarantees. God is dead, Zarathustra declares. God remains dead, and we have killed him. But this was no victory cry, it was a warning. Without God, humanity faced the terror of nihilism, the abyss of meaninglessness. The Übermensch was the answer, the one who stares into that abyss and says yes to life anyway. He followed Zarathustra with even sharper blows. In Beyond Good and Evil, he called morality a herd instinct, a system crafted by the weak to tame the strong. And on the genealogy of morality, he traced the origins of guilt, sin, and conscience not to divine revelation, but to power, resentment, and the will to dominate. Christianity, he argued, wasn't salvation. It was a slave revolt in ethics, a glorification of suffering that poisoned joy and strength. All of this poured out of him in bursts of feverish intensity. 10 hours a day hunched over his desk, eyes burning, hand cramping. He called his method philosophizing with a hammer, tapping idols to see if they rang hollow. And nearly all of them did. Yet for all his ferocity, Nietzsche's aim was never destruction for its own sake. He loved life, passionately, almost desperately. He reveled in sunlight, music, laughter, and the beauty of a well-turned phrase. His philosophy wasn't a doctrine, it was an invitation to become who you are, to embrace your contradictions, to live with courage in a godless cosmos. But the cost was steep, his solitude deepened. Friends drifted away, unnerved by his tone, his uncompromising vision. Publishers rejected his manuscripts. Readers were scarce. He lived on a modest pension, often cold, often hungry, always in pain. Still he wrote, relentlessly, as if racing against an unseen clock. And then, in January 1889, on a street in Turin, the clock stopped. The man who had declared war on pity wept over a horse being whipped by a coachman. He threw his arms around its neck and collapsed. His mind, strained to its limits by decades of intellectual combat and physical torment, gave way. The hammer had fallen one too many times. The prophet of the abyss had fallen into it himself. But his words did not die with his silence. They waited, coiled like lightning in the pages he left behind, ready to strike a world that had not yet learned it needed them. In a small apartment in Turin, on a cold January morning in 1889, Friedrich Nietzsche embraced a horse. It was being whipped by a coachman in the street. Nietzsche ran to it weeping, wrapped his arms around its neck and shattered, not physically, but inwardly. The mind that had wrestled with God's morals and the abyss of existence fell silent. He never wrote another word. He never spoke another coherent sentence. At 44, the philosopher entered a twilight of silence that would last 11 years, until his death in 1900. He returned to Germany, first under the care of his mother in Naumburg, then, after her death, his sister Elizabeth. And here, in the quiet horror of his final years, a different kind of tragedy unfolded, not of the mind, but of legacy. Elizabeth Nietzsche was not a philosopher. She was a nationalist, an anti-Semite, and a custodian of power. And she saw in her brother's unpublished notes, his fevered fragments, his unfinished visions, an opportunity. With ruthless editing, selective omissions, and outright fabrication, she stitched together a book she titled The Will to Power, presenting it as Nietzsche's magnum opus. It was nothing of the sort. It was a distortion shaped to fit her own ideological fantasies. Worse still, she welcomed the admiration of rising fascist movements. When the Nazis came to power decades later, they draped swastikas over Nietzsche's grave and quoted him in speeches. They called him their prophet. They twisted the Übermensch into a racial ideal, the will to power into a license for domination. Nothing could have horrified him more. Nietzsche despised anti-Semitism, mocked German nationalism, and called the state the coldest of all cold monsters. He would have spat at their idolatry, but myths are harder to kill than men. For years, Nietzsche remained tainted by association, a philosopher of cruelty, of elitism, of nihilistic despair. Yet even in darkness, his true voice echoed in unlikely places. In the cafes of post-war Paris, Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir found in him a call to radical freedom. Albert Camus saw in Nietzsche not a preacher of despair, but a defiant lover of life who wrestled with absurdity and never looked away. Later, Michel Foucault would call him the philosopher of suspicion, the one who taught us to question the hidden power behind every moral claim, every truth, every institution. Slowly, carefully, scholars began to peel back Elizabeth's distortions. They returned to Nietzsche's actual writings, his irony, his laughter, his reverence for art, his plea for human beings to create value rather than obey it. They discovered not a fascist, but a critic of herd morality, not a nihilist, but one who fought nihilism with every fiber of his being. And in the end, perhaps his greatest insight was this, that the death of God is not an end, but a beginning. A terrifying, exhilarating challenge. If there is no divine script, then we must write our own. If there is no ultimate meaning, then we must make meaning, through love, through art, through honest confrontation with suffering and joy. Today, Nietzsche speaks to rebels and seekers, to artists and scientists, to anyone who has ever looked up at a godless sky and refused to despair. He is quoted by punk rockers and Silicon Valley CEOs, by poets and prisoners, by those who feel too much and those who've been told they feel too little. He asked impossible questions. What if truth is a kind of error necessary for life? What if morality is just fear in a mask? What if the highest act of humanity is not to obey, but to become? He never claimed to have answers, only courage. And in a world still haunted by false idols, of ideology, of technology, of blind conformity, his voice remains as urgent as ever. Not because he told us what to think, but because he dared us to think for ourselves. Friedrich Nietzsche died in silence, but his lightning still strikes.